Greetings, traveler.
Hey guys, and welcome to my Arena Fundamentals video. I made this guide to assist you guys with the Taverns of Time event, which will be shaking up the arena for the next 3 weeks. However, the aim of this video is to help you guys with the fundamentals of Arena, which means that this should also help you even after the event. Let's get to it. In this video, I will be addressing the points where I feel there is the most room for improvement for players that either don't play Arena at all or don't really play a ton of Arena. The first thing on my list is synergy drafting. Now, it is important to build a deck that has a game plan in mind and to base your picks off which cards you already have. This is true. However, when you are new to the arena, you tend to overdo it by a lot. So an example would be your first card is a Lady in White, and from that moment on, every card that has more damage than health is suddenly unpickable because it doesn't go with the Lady in White. So that is not a very good strategy for Arena because it will limit your picks and you will generally get a much weaker deck than if you had drafted strong standalone cards. So what do you do instead? You have something called the vanilla test. So with this test, we determine, is a minion a good card regardless of the other cards in my deck already? We can do this by comparing a minion's mana cost to its stats. So here in this overview, you can see which stats are acceptable for what mana cost. Now there's a couple notes to this. The first one would be that once you start paying more than 6 mana for a minion, the rules change a little bit. You want to increase the chance that the minion will do something for you because you are investing a lot of mana, tempo into that card. If that card gets dealt with in an efficient manner, that is very bad for you. So the first way would be to have a minion that has a good death rattle. Now that can be a card such as a Violet Worm. That's a great example. Even if the Violet Worm gets efficiently dealt with, it will still spawn a bunch of 1/1s on the board, making sure that you can still do something with the card rather than just being detempoed. Second example would be a Charged Devilsaur. It's a card with initiative. So even if this card gets dealt with, you've usually already traded into a minion, meaning that once again, you have at least gotten something out of that minion rather than just losing it to a hard removal. A third example would be Taunt. Now, even though Taunt minions still get removed quite efficiently by, say, an Assassinate, they can't just be taunted out themselves, because this happens a lot as well, where your opponent is aggressively pushing on the board and you play one big minion, your opponent then plays one small taunt minion, he can then hit you in the face, and that's not good for you. Whereas if your big minion has taunt, at least your opponent is forced to deal with it. So while it is not as safe as the previous two when it comes to avoiding that tempo swing, it is still a lot better than just putting a pile of stats on the board without taunt or death rattle or initiative. All right, so an example of a bad big minion would then be an Ultrasaur. I know he's a crowd favorite, but paying 10 mana for just a pile of stats is just vulnerable to all the things we have mentioned, right? We can be taunted out by a small minion and achieve very little for our 10 mana, or we can just be hard removed, or just any of those things, and that's bad news. So when you're paying this much mana for a minion, make sure that it's going to do something for you. The second point is that you can pick understated tech cards such as a Stonehill Defender or a Spellbreaker, because while these cards are understated for their mana cost, they have a very beneficial effect. Those are things that we want. Now, if you're not sure whether the minion is worth it, err on the side of caution and pick minions that aren't understated. But cards such as Stonehill and Spellbreaker, they have definitely proven their worth, and you can pick them even though they don't have as much stats as their counterparts on that mana cost. Now, an important point here is that when you are mapping out your curve, whether you're checking, do I have enough 3-drops, do I have enough 4-drops, it's important for you to not count the Stonehill as a 3-drop or the Spellbreaker as a 4-drop, because these are tech cards, and tech cards are generally not played on curve. Now, if your opponent plays a light spawn and you can Spellbreaker him on curve, that's great, obviously, but most of the time, the Spellbreaker will not be that useful on curve. Stonehill, in essence, is just a Silverback Patriarch when he comes down. The powerful effect of Stonehill comes into play much later, once the added value of the hopefully powerful Taunt starts to really add up. So important when you're mapping out your curve, which we will cover in a little bit, do not count these tech cards. And then the last point is that when you are already deeper into the draft, let's say you're 20 picks in and you only have 1 3-drop, you can't be too picky. Now, in an ideal world, you only get offered 3 4s and 4 4s and egg nappers and whatnot, but sometimes you're just going to have to pick a regular 3/3, no effect, because it's a 3-mana card and it's better than skipping your turn on turn 3. So, final point, beggars can't be choosers. Once you're deeper into the draft, you'll have to lower your standards a bit. But definitely at the start of the draft, be picky and only pick cards that to play on curve, which pass the vanilla test. Okay guys, so far we've only been covering the drafting aspect of the game. We will be covering the gameplay as well. Now before we do that, I want to leave you guys with the choice whether you would like to go a bit more in depth on the current meta and how to draft. I've provided you guys with 2 deck lists with notes on what matters, how your curve should look like, little tips. I will also provide a link in the description, which links you guys to the actual draft, where you can see my thought process and which cards these cards were up against. So you can see how I make my decisions. We will be moving on to the playing aspect right now, but if you'd like to go a little bit more in depth, feel free to pause the video and check out those links in the description, check out those drafts. The first thing I'd like to cover in the gameplay segment of the video is tempo. Now, you've probably heard this term being thrown out a lot, and you probably have a fairly good understanding of what it means. We're just going to cover it very briefly so that you know how I use the term. For me, tempo is just the development of your board in relation to that of your opponents. So if I put more stuff on my board, that's a tempo play. If I remove stuff from my opponent's board, that is also a tempo play. Now, how efficient we do that in terms of how much mana I spend to get what effect, that determines whether a play is high in tempo or low in tempo. The main mistake I see when I see newer players playing Arena gameplay-wise is they play too much for value, which means they will often make a very weak tempo play in an attempt to gain card advantage. An example would be, I'm going to turn 3, coin my Elven Minstrel. While, yes, you get 2 cards and that feels good, you've still spent 4 mana on the stats of a 2-drop, because Elven Minstrel is a 3/2. We saw earlier in the video that a 3/2 body is worth 2 mana. So while you have made use of the coin to combo your Elven Minstrel, you've also just spent 4 mana on a 2-drop. And that's obviously not a good tempo play, while it is a nice value play. Now, inadvertently, you've put yourself in a terrible position where your opponent might just develop a Chillwind Yeti. For the same amount of mana, he's going to kill your Elven Minstrel, and he's going to be left with a 4/2 on the board, which may completely or at least partially contest your turn 4 play. Worst case scenario, the board just completely snowballs out of control, and you lose the game very quickly from that point on. So the best remedy to this problem, if you find yourself losing the board a lot, is ask yourself, how do I get the best possible board this turn? Now, is that going to make you a perfect player? Definitely not. There are going to be many board states where it is correct to hold back a little bit, it is correct to play for more value, and it's correct to not make the highest tempo play. but you'd be surprised how often the highest tempo play is the correct move. So once again, if you find yourself losing the board a lot, try to switch your way of thinking to how do I get the best possible board this turn, as opposed to how do I get the most out of my cards. And then as you consistently achieve that, you'll see that you'll win a lot of games just purely by playing for maximum tempo. And then once you're good at that, you can scale it back a little bit and reverse engineer. Okay, if I do this, I run out of cards a lot. Maybe here I should hold back and not play into that AoE effect, or maybe I should try to get a little bit more out of my card. And last but definitely not least, we have probably the most important aspect of Hearthstone, and that is identifying whether you are the aggro or the control. The simplest way of saying this, in Hearthstone terms is just saying, will you win the late game? Yes or no. If you will win the late game, you are the control. If not, you are the aggro. It's the aggro's job to end the game before that happens, and it's the control's job to stay alive and make sure that you actually arrive in the late game. So I will help you guys identify that. I'll put a list of questions on the screen here that helps you figure out whether you are the aggro or the control. Now, once you know your role, you can start to make different decisions based on that information. The first role we're going to discuss is the aggro. If you're the aggro, it's important that you realize that you are the playmaker, meaning that you need to dictate the pace of the game. That usually means that you need to be ahead on board and you need to interact with your opponent's minions the way how you would like to, with either buffs or weapons or removal, so that your minions on the board can hit the opponent's face. You get beneficial traits, you get buffs, etc., etc. Leading into that is the importance of face damage. When you are the aggro player, a lot of the time there won't be an ideal way to remove your opponent's minion. When that happens, it is usually very good for you to hit face. This happens a lot where you have 2 or 3 minions on the board, your opponent plays one big minion without taunt, ignore that, hit him in the face, preferably even have a nice little cheap hard removal to remove that minion and gain even more of a lead on the board. Now, a lot of the time, your opponent will not give you that ideal scenario where it is very easy to determine whether you should go face or not. And you need to then look at the board and say, okay, if I take this trait, will this drastically improve my position on the board? For instance, will it deny my opponent another good trait that he wants to make? If the answer is no, it is very often the case that you should go face anyway, even though the opponent didn't just play one big minion, and it's very easy to realize. The last point that's very important when you're the aggro is that you need to think of cards as a means to an end in this case, right? You do not need card advantage, you need just enough cards to finish the game. This means that you need to delay drawing cards. This is the same for the control as well, but it's so important that I want to mention it anyway, is that you need to delay drawing cards for as long as you can, because drawing cards is generally a very value-oriented move and a very low tempo move, which means that your position on the board will suffer because you opted to draw cards. So only draw cards when you actually need those cards to close out the game. You'll see this a lot with a sprint. Don't sprint until you absolutely have to. Another aspect of this is to play your minions even though you don't get full value out of them. Play your acidic Swampoos even though there's not a weapon. Play your stampeding Kodo even though you're not getting a hit. If they are the best tempo play, that is, right? Don't play your Kodo if you can just, develop a Spiteful Smith. But the logic behind this is that, let's say you hold that Kodo or that Ooze at the expense of losing a lot of tempo, and you happen to hit the weapon or the Kodo effect later on, chances are that because you played so slow and detempoed yourself, your opponent is going to be safe. He is going to have developed other minions, and that value you generated from hitting that acidic Swampoos or that stampeding Kodo is not going to matter because you're not winning that game through having more cards than your opponent anyway. you had to win that game through being ahead on board and hitting your opponent in the face. So that can be a trap where if you don't know whether you're the aggro or the control, you can make these slow plays, which can result in you losing the game very fast. All right, so on the controls side of things, the biggest one is don't be greedy, and that is obviously open to interpretation, but let me explain what I mean with that. It's playing a discover minion, or rather in this case, like a Stonehill, for instance, when you have a perfectly decent statted alternative, let's say an Indra Blade Master or Hilner Frost Rider. Only play that Stonehill when it's either really good on the board, your opponent has some 1/1s or a 5/1 or so, or it's your best play regardless. You don't have other cards in your hand or you need a taunt. Because you do get a stat penalty because the Stonehill is more of a value card. That's such a big one, and I see people doing that all the time, is don't detempo yourself. Don't be greedy, right? Use it later in the game. There's no need to rush those discovers or arcane intellects or so. Another part of this is to use your removal when it's good. So if that means you have to polymorph a medium-sized minion, so be it. A lot of the time, if you are the control versus the aggro, your opponent probably doesn't have that many big minions anyway, and you're not stuck in a value war where you need to get the absolute most out of that polymorph. The biggest one, however, is AoE. I see players do this all the time. When you're planning to AoE, a lot of the time they'll stop playing minions because they reason that, hey, if I play this minion and my opponent takes it out with his minion, and that minion was already going to die to AoE, my minion effectively accomplished nothing. I'm going to hold it in my hand and keep it for value. While that makes sense from a pure card for card point of view, for the board, that's a terrible move. Because first of all, there was no indication that you were going to have to use that AoE had you just played minions. Maybe your opponent wouldn't have had a great turn in terms of development, and he just had to trade it out, and after the smoke clears, you're like, maybe I don't have to flame strike this. And you can hold it another turn, and then as your opponent makes another push, then you can hit with the AoE, and then it was probably a game-winning one, rather than, this decent flame strike, but your opponent still had way more cards because you gave the board up way too quickly. Volcano is another really big one. Keep playing minions to delay the turn where you have to AoE. That's very good for you when you're the control in that matchup. Because after you've AoE'd, that's kind of it, right? You no longer have that safety net. If your opponent now gets control of the board, all you can do is sit there and take it in the face, right? Then the second part, right, of what you should do when you're the control is difficult, but very rewarding once you understand this, is you need to look for swing turns. That means that when you're the control, it's very likely that your opponent is going to be ahead on board due to them having a better curve or whatnot early. That means that you need to plan out a turn where you will be taking control of the board, or at least heavily reducing the size of their board. That can be by planning to coin out an AoE or so, but it can also be a bit more crafty, such as if you have a flame strike and a secret, you can put a secret down into their turn 7 or 6 or so, just the turn before you're going to flame strike. They'll probably play 2 smaller minions because they want to avoid giving you a big minion for a mirror entity, and then you can get a good flame strike. The other side of this is to do that in reverse, which means when you're the control, avoid giving your opponent that good swing turn, because even though the opponent will probably be ahead, he's looking for a turn to get even further ahead and seal the deal. This happens a lot when you're playing against a rogue. A rogue will generally be ahead on board due to having good early game cards, and then will look to seal the deal by landing a sap or a Vilespine or Kidnapper or just any other efficient single target removal on one of your big minions. You can avoid this by playing 2 smaller minions or a spell and a minion rather than spend all your mana on just one big minion. So that's a very applicable way of playing the game when you're playing against rogue in particular, but this happens against other classes all the time. Versus paladin, remove their minion rather than just play a minion into their minion, allowing them to buff. So you're just looking to avoid giving your opponent that swing turn. So look for swing turns yourself and try to avoid giving your opponent a swing turn. Okay, that's gonna be it for me, guys. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please do hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.